The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Morrison's carefully tended front yard as he slowly made his way down the wooden steps of his porch. At 93 years old, he moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to respect time but refused to be rushed by it. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, gripped a steaming cup of black coffee, the same way he had taken it since his days in the service, over 7 decades ago. Frank lived alone in the small blue house at the corner of Maple and Oak Street, where he had spent the last 45 years of his life. The neighborhood had changed around him, but his house remained a constant, like an anchor to simpler times. The white paint might have needed touching up in places, and the shutters could use some repair, but the garden, that was something else entirely. Every morning, without fail, Frank would sit in his old wooden rocking chair, watching the neighborhood come to life. The chair had been his wife Martha's favorite spot before she passed away 5 years ago. Now it was his daily comfort, a place where memories felt closer somehow. The local kids knew him as Grandpa Frank, the friendly old man who always had interesting stories and sometimes candy in his pockets. They especially loved his tales about World War II, though he was careful to share only the lighter moments. Stories about friendship, courage, and hope, rather than the darker aspects of war that still visited him in his dreams. Mrs. Chen from next door would wave to him every morning as she left for work at the local library. She often brought him homemade dumplings, claiming they were extras, though Frank suspected she made them especially for him. In return, he shared vegetables from his garden, the freshest tomatoes and cucumbers anyone in the neighborhood had ever tasted. The garden was Frank's pride and joy, his daily purpose. He had transformed his modest backyard into a small paradise over the years. Neat rows of vegetables grew alongside flowering plants that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. He knew every plant by name, treating them like old friends. The garden was more than just a hobby. It was his way of creating beauty in the world, of leaving something good behind. In his neat living room, medals and photographs from his military service hung on the walls, telling stories of a younger man who had served with the 101st Airborne Division. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star spoke of sacrifice and bravery, though Frank rarely talked about how he earned them. Instead, he preferred to show visitors his collection of unit patches and explain what each symbol meant. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Frank would walk to the local elementary school, where he volunteered as a reading buddy for first graders. The children were drawn to his gentle nature and patience, never seeming to notice his slight tremor or the hearing aid he wore. To them, he was simply the kind old man who made stories come alive with different voices for each character. Life had settled into a comfortable routine for Frank. He would tend to his garden in the early morning hours, read his newspaper on the porch, and sometimes play chess with Robert, the retired mailman who lived 3 houses down. In the afternoons, he might take a short nap or write letters to his grandchildren who lived in different states. They'd all had busy lives. They never forgot to call him every Sunday. The neighborhood wasn't as quiet as it used to be, and sometimes Frank missed the old days when he knew every family on the street. But he had made peace with change, adapting as he always had. His military training had taught him that flexibility was as important as strength, and he lived by that principle. What Frank didn't know, as he sat on his porch that peaceful morning, was that his quiet life was about to face an unexpected challenge. The old warehouse at the end of the street, empty for the past 2 years, had finally found new tenants. The rumble of motorcycles in the distance was about to change everything, but for now, Frank simply enjoyed his coffee, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday afternoon when Frank was watering his prized roses. The peaceful hum of bees and chirping of birds was suddenly drowned out by the thunderous roar of motorcycle engines. 5 motorcycles, their chrome parts gleaming in the sunlight, rolled down the street and turned into the old warehouse's parking lot. Frank watched as more bikes arrived throughout the day. By sunset, he counted at least 20 motorcycles parked outside the warehouse. The riders wore black leather vests with a logo he couldn't quite make out, a red skull with crossed chains. The sound of heavy metal music began drifting down the street, growing louder as darkness fell. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. The music pounded through his walls until 3 in the morning. Mrs. Chen called him the next day, worried about the noise. Even Mr. Thompson, who was partially deaf, complained about the vibrations shaking his windows. Frank decided to handle the situation the way he always had, with politeness and respect. On Wednesday morning, Frank put on his best cardigan sweater and his Korean War veteran cap. He walked slowly down to the warehouse, rehearsing the words in his mind. Two young men with tattoos covering their arms stood smoking by the entrance. They watched him approach with amused expressions. "Good morning," Frank said, trying to keep his voice steady and friendly. "I'm Frank Morrison from up the street. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood and maybe talk about the music." The taller of the two men, who had a snake tattoo winding up his neck, smirked. "Well, look what we got here, Jake, a fossil coming to give us a lecture." His friend laughed, flicking cigarette ash onto Frank's shoes. "I'm not here to lecture," Frank explained calmly. "It's just that many of us are older folks who—" The roar of a motorcycle engine cut him off. A massive black bike pulled up, its rider revving the engine repeatedly. The noise was so loud that Frank had to cover his ears, his hearing aids squealing from the sound. The two men laughed harder. That night was worse than the first. Every time the noise would die down, someone would rev their engines or turn the music up louder. Frank sat in his living room, looking at Martha's picture on the wall, wondering what she would advise him to do. The situation deteriorated over the next few days. The bikers seemed to take special pleasure in tormenting the old veteran. They would park their bikes in front of his house, blocking his driveway. Empty beer cans began appearing in his garden. One morning, he found his mailbox knocked over. Frank called the police twice, but they seemed reluctant to do anything. "Just a noise complaint," they said. "Nothing we can really do unless they break the law." The third time he called, he overheard one officer telling another, "It's that old man again." The final straw came when Frank discovered his prized roses trampled one morning. Tire tracks cut through his garden beds, destroying months of careful tending. Mrs. Chen found him sitting on his porch steps, tears in his eyes, looking at the ruined flowers. "You should move, Mr. Morrison," she suggested gently. "My sister has a nice apartment complex for seniors." But Frank Morrison hadn't survived World War II, built a life from nothing, and raised 3 children to be pushed out of his home by bullies. That evening, as he watched the bikers setting up for another loud party, something changed in his expression. The defeated look in his eyes was replaced by a familiar determination, the same look he'd had as a young soldier facing impossible odds. Walking into his house, Frank went straight to his study. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath old photos and letters, lay a small address book. Its pages were yellowed with age, but the numbers inside still connected him to people who understood what words like honor, respect, and brotherhood truly meant. As the first sounds of heavy metal music began to shake his windows, Frank picked up his phone. The call he was about to make would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire neighborhood. Sometimes, he thought, you had to fight fire with fire, or in this case, bikers with bikers. The morning after Frank made his call, the bikers seemed more aggressive than ever. Perhaps they sensed something was different about the old veteran's demeanor, or maybe they just wanted to assert their dominance over the neighborhood. Whatever the reason, they chose to make that day particularly unpleasant for Frank. It started at dawn. 3 motorcycles circled his block repeatedly, their engines deliberately backfiring. Frank watched from his kitchen window as he tried to steady his shaking hands enough to pour his morning coffee. The cup rattled against the saucer, not from fear, but from the deep anger he was trying to control. By mid-morning, 6 bikers had parked their motorcycles directly in front of Frank's house. They sat on their bikes, smoking and talking loudly about the old-timer who thought he could tell them what to do. Frank could hear every word through his open windows. They wanted him to hear. "Hey, Grandpa," one of them shouted, a heavy-set man with a scraggly beard. "How's the garden today? Need any help rearranging those flowers?" The others laughed, remembering how they had destroyed his rose beds the day before. Mrs. Chen tried to bring Frank some lunch, but the bikers blocked her path. "Sorry, lady," said the one with the snake tattoo, spreading his arms wide. "Private party today. No visitors allowed." She had to leave the food on her own porch, watching helplessly as Frank remained trapped in his home. Around 2 o'clock, things got worse. The bikers started throwing empty beer cans into Frank's yard. Each time one landed, they cheered as if they were scoring points in a game. Some cans hit his windows, making loud clanking sounds that reminded Frank of distant gunfire, a sound he had hoped to never hear again. Robert, the retired mailman, tried to intervene. He walked up to the group, attempting to reason with them. "This man fought for your freedom," he said, pointing toward Frank's house. "Show some respect." The bikers' response was to rev their engines so loudly that Robert's words were drowned out completely. One of them, a younger member with a shaved head, got off his bike and walked right up to Robert. "You want to be next, old man?" he threatened, poking Robert's chest with his finger. Inside his house, Frank paced back and forth in his living room. The walls were covered with his military photographs, young men in uniform, smiling despite the weight of war on their shoulders. His eyes kept going to one particular photo, showing his old unit standing proud and strong. The memory of their brotherhood gave him strength, but it also reminded him of how powerless he felt right now. The police finally showed up around 4 o'clock, after multiple calls from neighbors. Two young officers talked to the bikers for a few minutes, but nothing changed. As soon as the patrol car left, the harassment continued. The bikers now added wheelies to their show, the screeching of tires adding to the chaos. Frank sat in his rocking chair, Martha's old chair, and closed his eyes. He thought about the call he had made the night before, wondering if it would make any difference. The man he'd spoken to had seemed concerned, had promised to handle it, but what could anyone really do against these thugs? As evening approached, the bikers set up for what they announced would be their biggest party yet. They dragged old furniture from the warehouse into the street, creating a makeshift outdoor lounge. Their numbers had grown to nearly 30 now, with more arriving every hour. Someone set up massive speakers facing directly at Frank's house. The bass was so powerful it made his windows rattle. Pictures began falling off his walls, including his treasured bronze star, the frame cracking as it hit the floor. That was the moment something snapped inside Frank Morrison, not in a violent way, but in the calm, determined way that old soldiers know. He picked up his phone again. The first call had been to an old friend. This one would be to someone with even more influence. As the sun set and the party reached new levels of chaos, Frank Morrison sat quietly in his darkened living room. His jaw was set firm, his eyes hard with determination. Help was coming. He just had to hold out a little longer. Tomorrow, these bikers would learn an important lesson about respect, brotherhood, and the mistake of underestimating a veteran of the greatest generation. That night, with the bikers' party still raging outside, Frank couldn't sleep. The bass from their music made the floors vibrate, and occasional shouts pierced through his walls. Around midnight, he decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He went up to his attic. The attic stairs creaked under his careful steps as he used his flashlight to guide the way. The space smelled of old wood and memories, filled with boxes that held pieces of his long life. In the far corner sat an old trunk, its green paint chipped and faded, but the U.S. Army stenciling still visible on its side. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he opened the trunk. Inside, wrapped in an old army blanket, lay his wartime memorabilia. He pulled out his old uniform first, running his fingers over the patches and medals. The fabric was still crisp, preserved by Martha's careful storage all those years ago. Beneath the uniform, he found what he was looking for, a leather-bound album with 101st Airborne Division embossed in gold on its cover. The binding crackled as he opened it, releasing the scent of aged paper and leather. Frank settled down on an old chair, brushing away cobwebs, and began to turn the pages. Each photograph told a story. Young faces looked back at him, frozen in time. There was Jimmy Lucky Martinez, who could find food anywhere. Tommy Chen, the best radio operator in the unit. And there, in the center of a group photo, stood Frank himself, young and strong, surrounded by his brothers in arms. One particular photo caught his eye. It showed his entire unit standing in front of their barracks. They called themselves the Screaming Eagles, and the pride in their faces was unmistakable. Frank remembered the day this photo was taken, just after they had completed a difficult mission together. As he stared at the photo, a memory surfaced. It was about a time when his unit was surrounded by enemy forces. They were outnumbered and running low on supplies. The situation had seemed hopeless, just like it did now with the bikers. But then something remarkable happened. Other units had heard about their situation. Without being asked, they came to help. Soldiers from different divisions, men they had never met, arrived to support them. They called it the Brotherhood Code. No soldier gets left behind, no veteran stands alone. A particularly loud burst of laughter from outside brought Frank back to the present. He looked at the photo again, but this time with different eyes. These weren't just memories, they were a reminder of something important. The brotherhood he had experienced during the war hadn't ended when he took off his uniform. Frank pulled out his phone and opened his contact list. Over the years, he had collected numbers from various veteran meetings and reunions. Some were from his old unit, others from veteran support groups. He had never needed to use these numbers before, always wanting to handle things on his own. But now, looking at those young faces in the photographs, Frank remembered what his commanding officer used to say: "True strength isn't about fighting alone, it's about knowing when to call in reinforcements." With renewed purpose, Frank gathered several photos from the album. He carefully selected ones that showed the unity and strength of his military days. Using his phone, he took pictures of these old photographs, his hands steady now with determination. As he made his way back downstairs, the noise from outside seemed less threatening. Frank sat at his kitchen table and began composing messages to send with the photos. He wrote about his situation, about the bikers, and about how he needed help not just for himself, but for his whole neighborhood. The first response came within minutes, then another, and another. Each message showed the same spirit of brotherhood he remembered from his service days. As Frank read them, a small smile formed on his face, the first real smile in days. Outside, the bikers continued their party, unaware that their actions had just set in motion something much bigger than they could imagine. Frank Morrison might have been a 93-year-old veteran, but he was about to remind everyone that old soldiers never lose their ability to fight, they just learn to fight smarter. The next morning dawned with an unusual energy in the air. Frank sat at his kitchen table, his phone buzzing with messages every few minutes. After sending those photos last night, the response had been overwhelming. Veterans from all over the state were organizing themselves, spreading his story through their networks. His first important call had been to James "Iron Jim" Thompson, the state coordinator for the Veterans of Foreign Wars, VFW. Jim had served in Vietnam and understood exactly what Frank was going through. Within an hour of their conversation, Jim had shared Frank's story in 30 different veteran group chats. "Your situation isn't just about noise complaints anymore, Frank," Jim had said over the phone. "It's about respect for our veterans, and we take care of our own." By mid-morning, Frank's story had reached veteran motorcycle clubs in 5 neighboring states. These weren't ordinary bike clubs. They were organized groups of former military personnel who shared a love of motorcycles and a deep respect for their fellow veterans. Frank watched in amazement as his phone filled with messages from people he'd never met. Marine veterans from the Desert Storm era offered to drive up from 3 states away. Air Force veterans were coordinating meeting points. Army Rangers were planning routes. Even a group of Navy SEALs had gotten wind of the situation. Around noon, Mrs. Chen brought over some lunch and found Frank surrounded by printouts of messages and maps. His hands were steady now as he showed her the responses he'd received. "Look at this," he said, pointing to one message. "The Rolling Thunder Veterans Group has 200 members coming. And here, the American Legion Riders are sending 3 chapters." Mrs. Chen smiled, seeing the spark back in her old friend's eyes. The local news had somehow picked up the story. A young reporter called Frank, asking about the veteran solidarity movement that was trending on social media. Frank didn't even know what trending meant, but his grandson explained it over the phone. His story was spreading fast. By late afternoon, Frank received a call that brought tears to his eyes. On the other end of the line was Colonel Marcus Peterson, now retired but once Frank's commanding officer's son. "My father always spoke highly of you, sir," Peterson said. "We're mobilizing the current 101st Airborne Veteran Network. We'll be there." The bikers at the warehouse seemed oblivious to what was coming. They spent the day as usual, playing loud music and revving their engines. One of them even rode past Frank's house, deliberately backfiring his motorcycle. Frank just watched quietly from his window, knowing what tomorrow would bring. That evening, Frank sat in his living room looking at a new message that had just arrived. It was a simple map showing convoy routes from all directions, leading to his neighborhood. Small dots represented groups of veteran riders, all converging on his location. The organization and precision reminded him of military operation plans from his service days. Robert, the retired mailman, stopped by to check on Frank. He found his old friend studying the messages with military focus. "They're really coming?" Robert asked, amazed at the response. Frank nodded, showing him the latest numbers. Over 500 veterans had confirmed they were on their way. Tomorrow morning, Frank said quietly, "Those troublemakers are going to learn something important about veteran brotherhood." As night fell, Frank made one final call to Jim to confirm the timing. Everything was set. Veteran riders would begin arriving at dawn, with the main group scheduled for 10 a.m. The bikers at the warehouse were planning another big party for tomorrow, completely unaware that their usual parking spots would be occupied by hundreds of veterans on motorcycles. Frank slept peacefully that night, for the first time in weeks. The rumble of motorcycles from the warehouse didn't bother him anymore. Soon, a different kind of rumble would be heard in the neighborhood, the sound of brotherhood, respect, and justice rolling in on two wheels. The revolution he had started with a simple call for help was about to change everything, not just for him, but for the entire community. The sun had barely risen when Frank heard the first distant rumble. It wasn't the harsh, angry sound of the troublemakers' bikes. This was different. This was the coordinated approach of disciplined riders, moving in formation. Standing on his porch, coffee cup in hand, Frank watched as the first group appeared. 20 motorcycles turned onto his street, their riders wearing leather vests covered in military patches. They moved with perfect precision, like a well-trained unit. The lead rider, a tall man with silver hair, pulled up in front of Frank's house and saluted. "2nd Battalion, 75th Rangers, reporting for duty, sir." Before Frank could respond, another rumble filled the air. From the opposite direction came 30 more riders, their vests showing Marine Corps insignias. Their leader, a woman with short gray hair and sharp eyes, parked her bike and walked up to Frank. "Master Sergeant Sarah Martinez, Marine Corps Veterans Association. We heard you needed some backup, sir." By 8 o'clock, over 100 veterans had arrived. They parked their motorcycles in neat rows along both sides of the street. Each group that arrived reported to Frank like he was their commanding officer. Some were Vietnam veterans, others had served in Desert Storm, and many were younger veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. Mrs. Chen came out with coffee and donuts for everyone. She couldn't stop smiling as she watched the veterans helping each other set up a command post on Frank's front lawn. They had brought folding tables, communication equipment, and even a small generator. Everything was organized with military efficiency. Around 9 o'clock, a special arrival made Frank's heart skip a beat. 3 riders pulled up on gleaming motorcycles, their vests bearing the distinctive patch of the 101st Airborne Division. The leader removed his helmet, revealing a face that looked just like Frank's old commanding officer. "Colonel Peterson's son," the man said, shaking Frank's hand. "Dad couldn't make it, but he sent his best men." The troublemakers at the warehouse were usually still sleeping at this hour after their late-night parties. But today, the sound of hundreds of approaching motorcycles had drawn them out. They stood in their parking lot, watching in disbelief as more and more veterans arrived. The scene was incredible. Bikes of all types lined the streets: Harley-Davidsons, Indians, BMWs, and more. Their riders represented every branch of the military and every era of service from World War II to the present. Some had traveled through the night to be there, coming from as far as 3 states away. By 10 o'clock, the number had swelled to over 500 veterans. They formed a human chain around Frank's property, standing at parade rest. The troublemakers' motorcycles were now completely surrounded by a sea of veterans' bikes, each one polished to a military shine. Frank walked among the gathered veterans, shaking hands and hearing their stories. Many showed him photos of their own grandfathers who had served in World War II. Others shared stories about how veterans had helped them in their time of need. This wasn't just about confronting bullies. It was about showing the true meaning of military brotherhood. Local news crews began arriving, attracted by the unusual sight. Reporters interviewed veterans who had traveled hundreds of miles to support a fellow soldier they had never met. One journalist asked Frank how he felt about the response to his call for help. "In the military," Frank replied, his voice steady and proud, "we learned that no soldier fights alone. Today, these fine men and women are reminding everyone what that means." The veterans had brought more than just their motorcycles. They carried with them the weight of history, the power of unity, and the unbreakable bonds of military service. As they stood together under the late morning sun, they created an image of strength and solidarity that would be remembered in the neighborhood for years to come. Frank looked at the gathered crowd of veterans, their faces showing the same determination he had seen in his old war photographs. The troublemakers at the warehouse were about to learn an important lesson, not through violence or threats, but through the overwhelming presence of people who understood the true meaning of respect and honor. Around 11 o'clock, the troublemaker bikers finally emerged as a group from their warehouse. There were about 30 of them, led by their leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo who had been the main source of Frank's troubles. They tried to look tough as they walked down the street, but their usual confidence was clearly shaken by the sight before them. Colonel Peterson's son, Mike, stepped forward to meet them. Behind him stood hundreds of veterans, their faces calm but determined. The contrast was striking, the troublemakers with their messy appearance and nervous glances, facing veterans who stood with military discipline and quiet strength. "Looks like we're having a party crasher convention," the snake-tattooed leader said, trying to sound brave. His voice wasn't as loud as usual, and his hands kept fidgeting with his leather jacket. Mike Peterson spoke in a calm, clear voice that carried down the street. "We're not here for a party. We're here because you've been disrespecting a World War II veteran, a man who fought for the freedoms you take for granted." The troublemakers shifted uncomfortably as Mike gestured toward Frank, who stood surrounded by fellow veterans. Some of the younger bikers in the group were already backing away, sensing this wasn't going to end well for them. "That old man," their leader scoffed, but his voice cracked slightly. "He's been complaining about our noise. This is a free country, we can do what we want." A female Marine veteran stepped forward, Master Sergeant Martinez. Her voice was sharp as she replied, "Free country? Let me tell you about that free country. That man over there," she pointed at Frank, "was storming beaches under enemy fire while your grandfather was still in diapers. He earned every bit of peace and quiet he deserves." The crowd of veterans murmured in agreement. Some of them moved their hands to reveal their own military medals pinned to their vests. The troublemakers' eyes widened as they began to realize just how many decorated soldiers they were facing. "You've been vandalizing his garden," another veteran spoke up. "Throwing trash in his yard, keeping him prisoner in his own home. That ends today." The snake-tattooed leader tried one last time to maintain his authority. "This is our territory now. You can't just..." He was cut off by the sound of hundreds of veteran bikers starting their motorcycles in perfect unison. The roar was deafening, not the chaotic noise the troublemakers made, but a coordinated symphony of power. The ground itself seemed to shake. After a few seconds, Mike raised his hand, and all the engines cut off at once, leaving a silence that spoke volumes. The message was clear. The veterans could play the noise game too, but with far more impressive results. "Here's what's going to happen," Mike said calmly. "You're going to clean up every bit of trash you've thrown in Frank's yard. You're going to fix his garden. You're going to apologize to him and every neighbor you've harassed. And then you're going to find a new place for your club, one that's not in a residential area." The troublemaker's leader looked around, seeing his options disappear. His followers were already backing away, some even removing their club vests. He could try to fight, but he was facing hundreds of combat-trained veterans. He could call the police, but several officers who had arrived to monitor the situation were veterans themselves, watching with approving smiles. "And if we don't?" he managed to ask, though he already knew the answer. A gray-haired Vietnam veteran stepped forward, his vest covered in combat medals. "Then we'll be back. Every day, every night. Hundreds of us. Thousands even. We take care of our own, son. That's something you clearly need to learn." The fight went out of the troublemakers' eyes. Their leader's shoulders slumped in defeat. Looking at the wall of veterans before him, he made the first smart decision of his life. He nodded in agreement. As the troublemakers began picking up their trash under the watchful eyes of the veterans, Frank stood on his porch, watching justice being served not through violence, but through the power of unity and respect. The revolution he had started with a single phone call had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The transformation of the neighborhood happened faster than anyone expected. The day after the confrontation, the troublemaker bikers spent hours cleaning up their mess. Under the watchful eyes of several veteran riders who stayed behind, they picked up every piece of trash, fixed Frank's broken mailbox, and even tried to salvage what they could of his damaged garden. Their leader, who introduced himself properly as Jake Matthews, worked alongside his men. As he helped replant Frank's roses, he shared something unexpected. His own grandfather had been a Korean War veteran who had passed away the previous year. "I forgot what it meant to show respect," Jake admitted to Frank, dirt on his hands from planting new rose bushes. My grandpa would have been ashamed of how I acted. The warehouse that had been the source of so much trouble was cleaned out within a week. The troublemaker bikers found a new location for their club in an industrial area, far from any homes. But something interesting happened. Several of them started coming back to visit Frank, not to cause trouble, but to listen to his stories. Word of what had happened spread through veteran communities across the country. Frank's story appeared in military newsletters and veteran websites. Letters began arriving from all over, thanking him for standing up and reminding people about the importance of respecting veterans. Mrs. Chen's garden now connected with Frank's, creating a beautiful shared space where neighborhood children came to learn about flowers and vegetables. Every Saturday morning, some of the veterans who had come to Frank's aid would return to help with the gardening and share coffee on his porch. The local VFW chapter established an annual event called the Veterans Ride for Respect, starting and ending at Frank's Street. Hundreds of veterans would gather each year, not just to ride, but to remind everyone about the bonds of brotherhood that never fade. Even more surprisingly, Jake and some of his former troublemakers joined a veteran support group. They started helping at the local VA hospital, learning about the sacrifices veterans had made. Jake's motorcycle club transformed into a community service organization, using their love of bikes to raise money for veteran causes. One sunny morning, about a month after everything had happened, Frank sat in his rocking chair watching the neighborhood children playing safely in the street again. Robert, the retired mailman, joined him with 2 cups of coffee. "You know what's funny?" Robert said, handing Frank his cup. "When you made that call for help, you weren't just solving a problem. You were teaching a lesson about brotherhood that crossed generations." Frank nodded, looking at his restored garden where new roses were starting to bloom. The morning was peaceful, broken only by the occasional friendly wave from passing neighbors. The contrast from just a month ago was remarkable. Colonel Peterson's son still visited every week, often bringing other veterans with him. They had become like family to Frank, filling his quiet house with laughter and stories. Some even started calling him Grandpa Frank, just like the neighborhood kids did. The most touching moment came when the neighborhood organized a surprise birthday party for Frank. Veterans from all over the state returned to celebrate, and even Jake's group showed up with a special gift, a custom-made plaque that read, "To Frank Morrison, a true American hero who taught us about respect." As Frank's story continued to inspire others, more communities started similar programs, connecting troubled youth with veterans who could mentor them. The revolution that started with one veteran's call for help had grown into a movement about respect, understanding, and the power of standing together. Every evening now, when Frank watered his roses, he would hear the sound of motorcycles in the distance. But these weren't the angry, disruptive noises of before. These were the respectful rides of veterans and reformed bikers, checking on their friend, making sure he was okay. The neighborhood had changed forever. What started as a story about an elderly veteran being bullied had become a lesson about community, respect, and the enduring strength of military brotherhood. Frank's quiet stand had reminded everyone that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting battles, but from bringing people together in understanding and respect.